All right, so next up is our satin stitch, and I've already done a few to show sort of a visual representation before we get started, but as you can see, we're going to be doing straight stitches side by side to create a satin stitch. I'm going to use 3 strands, so I've already done 2 and 5. And how I'm going to start is I'm going to split right down the middle. So I basically, when I'm doing any satin stitches, I pick a section and I sort of like divide the borders, or I define the borders, I guess, and then divide in half. So I will do my outside stitches, and then I'm splitting it in half, and then I'm going to go back and split it more. So a few tricks for this stitch is, of course, like doing that splitting of the sections, but then to keep your stitch as straight as possible, there's a few techniques that you can use. I like obviously to split them because it helps me, you know, follow the same angle as the other ones. Sometimes when you're going like side by side, you might end up on an angle like this and you don't notice till you get to this last one. So making the spaces between your next stitch smaller helps. But there's another technique where you can actually use your needle and look at the weave of the fabric and kind of follow your way down the weave of the fabric till you come to the bottom. And this is actually quite helpful depending on your weave. Some of them are easier. This one I find you do have the weave is visible, so making that perfectly straight line is possible. So we're going to do half to show how we're splitting these sections. So the same thing over here. I'm going to go right in the center of it. And then you can just eyeball it like this and then come down, or you can do the following the weave with your needle. Try not to lose it, and then coming to the bottom here. Okay. And then again, just filling in sort of those spaces. And you can do the same thing at the top to try to make your line perfectly straight, because where you start your satin stitch at the top here is also going to help define how even and accurate your satin stitch is. So in this case, like trying to keep these all exactly at the same point on the weave going this direction as well as going this direction. Because if you have one that you've maybe gone a little bit further, it's going to stick out. So that's an important aspect. And then obviously keeping them as straight as possible. So with this one, it's a little simpler because like I only have basically a stitch length between. So I don't necessarily have to follow the weave. I think following the weave works the best when you're kind of in a big open space and you don't really have those guides around you. Now that we've defined the angle, like I can kind of see that if I come and I split right in the center here, that's going to be the right spot. And then one part of like an effective satin stitch is obviously how flat you make your stitches. One thing that can sometimes happen that will sort of make your satin stitch not look as nice as the others is if you have 3 strands here and say they're twisted. If one strand is maybe twisted or they're folded over each other, they're not laying like side by side. So you can pull it out. This is what I do. I pull the stitch out if it's not laying perfectly flat. And then I kind of run my needle like this with the 3 strands side by side. Just making sure that it's like, they are kind of all flat, and then I pull it tight and it makes them lay like perfectly flat instead of that twisted. When they're twisted, they don't blend as nicely with their neighbors. So I'm going to come up. Satin stitch definitely requires a lot of patience, and you have to be somewhat meticulous. So this has a line for me, so I can just follow the line. I'm going to go in the exact spot. And sometimes I don't hit the exact spot with my needle on the first try, so. Okay, and then coming down, and the same thing, just making sure that my threads are laying flat and they aren't all twisted. And the same thing if you maybe have like out of 3 strands, one of them is sitting, like one of them doesn't come down flat. One of you got like kind of that little bump that sometimes happens with one strand. You can pull them all out and then tug from the back to try to get them all even. So same thing here, just, and you can see even from me doing that, the difference on this one and this one, it definitely sits a little bit flatter, a little bit more cohesive. So if you are working on a satin stitch where you want absolute perfection, those are some tricks that are going to really help. Slow and steady. And then obviously less strands. So the less strands you use, the flatter your satin stitch is going to be, and the more detailed you can make the stitches. So you can really like make each stitch perfectly. If you do a 1 strand satin stitch, you're going to end up with, it's going to take you very, very long, but it's going to create a very flat, detailed design, because you can really get in there and make sure each strand sits exactly where you want it to. A 6 strand satin stitch is going to be chunkier, it's going to be fuller. The stitches are going to be more defined as individual stitches, no matter how much work we do on trying to like kind of, and that's another thing too that I sometimes do is I use my needle to run along them to kind of like fluff them up, but also make them lay straight. And the big thing is the aesthetic of each like design. Depending on the aesthetic you're going for, you may want that 6 strand with the chunkier, fuller look. Can have lots of 3D look to it when you're using 6 strands. It can have, yeah, just like a fluffier design. Whereas if you're looking for something that has like an ultra realistic look and you're trying to define a design, 6 strands isn't going to give you that. So it's just about sort of applying the right strands to get the right look. So that is our 6 strands. That is our 3 strands in a satin stitch. And I'll hop over and do 6 strands to just show you how that one looks. And then I'll meet you back when you have 6 strands on your needle. Okay, so like we were saying, the 6 strands is going to be bulkier. It's going to have, you're going to see each stitch a bit more defined than you would on, say, a 1-2 strand. But a few tips if you want to try to make it as seamless as possible. One of the first things you can do is when you put your 6 strands together, you can actually take your 6 strands of floss and do what's called, like, it would be, I don't know, kind of called like splitting your floss, and then you put it back together. So I don't know what the term for that would be called. I think a lot of people do that when they do embroidery, and it's not necessarily a technique that I use when it comes to 6 strands, but it definitely creates a different look with your strand. So like I was saying earlier, when you're trying to get all 6 strands to lay side by side, they are twisted together. That's how 6 strands are put together. So if you take them all apart before threading your needle, you divide them into 6 individual strands and then you put them back together, they're no longer twisted. So you can get the individual strands to sit sometimes more flat. There's debates in my head all the time about whether I want to do a separate my strands for woven wheels and then put them back together. It has a different look. So when you separate the strands for like a woven wheel or for a satin stitch like this, you're doing you're changing the look. Instead of it being like a string or a strand, which the 6 strands is a strand, or Sorry, my brain is pausing. It is a twisted strand. You're untwisting that. So you're creating more of individual strands. So but for me, in this case, when I'm doing this, the way that I pull my thread out to make sure that each individual strand is sitting flat, it sort of does that without like in the process. And I kind of do that as I go. So if you can see, as I'm going down to find my spot, I kind of split the strands a little bit with my needle, and then I find my spot, I come down, and then before I actually lay it flat, I make sure that everything is pretty much untwisted. And in that process, like those 6 strands are separated. Those 6 strands are individual and they're going to lay flat instead of twisted. And that kind of, sometimes they twist up a little bit and I have to untwist them, or I have to pull it out and fix them a little bit. But I think that the time that it takes to separate your strands and then put your strands back together is something that I can do on this step instead of like in this step of the process instead of before. And that's just a personal preference, but it's also not something that you even have to do. You don't have to do this portion where I'm kind of splitting them to get them to lay flat either. You can just be okay with the strands looking like twisted 6 strands. Hopefully that's making sense. I know that I am rambling a little bit. All right, and then so in the context of, say, a woven wheel, you aren't able to do this sort of running your needle to separate them, but with that, it does create a different look on the wheel. And that's something that I would actually recommend you experimenting with if you'd like to, just to see which your personal preference is, because I can't tell you which one is better or worse. But let's take a look here. You can see that I haven't split these strands yet with my needle, and you can very much see a defined strand versus these ones, which are quite individual, and they look as individual strands instead of one big 6 strand. But you can see here, and maybe what we'll do is on this half of this one, I won't fiddle with the strand too much. I won't separate the strands with my needle, and we'll just see sort of what one half looks like not separated and just sort of stitched down where I'm not laying each strand flat. And you can get that visual representation of the 2 different styles. I definitely think that when you use the 6 strands and they're still twisted, you get a fuller look. It's gonna look more weighted, but it also, in my opinion, looks a bit choppier. So fuller, but also each strand is very visible as to which that they are separate from each other. Sometimes the goal with a satin stitch is to make it look like you can't tell where one stitch starts and the other one ends. So you can see, and I hope you can see from there, that this one's definitely fuller, and I think you can see the more individual stitches versus this one where it's a little bit harder to tell, and it could, you might not be able to tell 6 strands versus 5 there. So just some personal preference stuff, and experimenting with that is going to be sort of how you learn what you like best. So there is our satin stitches. We are going to move on to our next stitch, and I will meet you back with the same 6 strands on your needle, so you can just tie off and meet me back over here, and we'll start working on our woven wheels.